So this event will look how the state turns us into people who fight against each other and turn on each other, and importantly how professionals in their roles, whether that's GPs, social workers, civil servants and teachers, can actually take on a policing role when their duty is to care. They are pushed into situations where they police their clients and they police us. And again, using my own experience around Hillsborough, I have some brilliant examples of how the social workers were used by the investigating force of West Midlands Police, the notorious West Midlands Police, to actually police fans. They wouldn't let them see videos which had crucial evidence, and they policed them, and it was something we used to buck against and came up against terrible things. So the important thing is it's policies and how the increased policies that crush communities, and from our point of view, the resistance and why it's more important to resist those policies, and how we have to make people aware that we do have to challenge. So we might be suspect communities, but we will fight back. I suppose the most recent example is, you know, and again, drawing on my own experiences as someone who joined the Labour Party for Jeremy Corbyn and who is now subsequently expelled, how Labour Party members became, you know, part of a suspect community because they had socialist ideals, socialist policies. So it's so important to challenge, and I think what is crucial to it is that we are organised to challenge, and the platform today here draws from a wide breadth of people to show how by organising we are better equipped to fight back as suspect communities. So with that in mind, I'd like to, the first speaker to introduce Shane O'Curry. Shane's the director of the Irish Network Against Racism and directs a civil society network of anti-racists and grassroots organisations and community groups which aim to work collectively to highlight and address the issue of racism in Ireland, including through the promotion and monitoring of EU and global anti-racist initiatives. INAR is a member of the European Network Against Racism based in Brussels. So Shane, if you'd speak first, thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. It's a real honour to be here, to have been invited to speak at a Bloody Sunday weekend, and it's great to be here among friends and comrades, and I feel very warm seeing a lot of faces here. So thanks very much for inviting me. I was thinking about this frame, suspect communities, and the experiences from my understanding from the monitoring that INAR does of racism in the 26 counties. And how does their experience fit into that frame of suspect communities? So, and how it captures their lived experiences living in a state that's hostile to them. And if you'll forgive me, I'll take you back to some of the writing about suspect communities, because I was struggling to fit it in, because my first instinct was, well, it doesn't really fit in the 26 county context, because unlike Britain, the US, France, and other places where the suspect communities model clearly does fit, the South of Ireland isn't a former colonial power, right? And that was my kind of first off instinctive thinking. But but if you think about the experiences of the lived experience of racialized communities in the 26 counties, so I'm going to take you through a little bit about the three writers that I do know who write about suspect communities to kind of outline the thesis about suspect communities. So the first is Paddy Hilliard, who wrote the seminal piece, Suspect Communities, in the 1970s about the experiences of the Irish in Britain under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The second is Arun Kudnani, who built on Hilliard's thesis and wrote a seminal book called The Muslims Are Coming. The third is Mark McGovern, whose work, Counter-Terrorism and Counterproductive, takes both of those pieces of work and looks at the comparative context of the experiences of Muslims in Britain and Republican stroke nationalist communities in the north of Ireland at the height of the conflict. And so I'll just take you a little bit through each of them. So Paddy Hilliard first put forward the idea of suspect community, starting with the British state imperative in the 1970s to counter terrorism and using the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which had a very focused and deliberate impact, singling out the Irish community. It had a profound marginalising and othering impact on the entire community, which was designated as worthy of surveillance and suspicion by virtue of people's Irish identity. Collective punishment, human rights abuses, wrongful arrests, convictions, imprisonments, and unlawful killings or state executions, if you like, were justified by exceptional legislation, by the perceived dangerous and violent threat from people, and a raft of police practices and accompanying right-wing media and political discourse, which had a devastating impact, as with almost all. And again, what he also showed is, with almost all contexts, this was actually counterproductive to their outcomes because it only fed the resistance. Mark McGovern uses Hilliard's suspect communities frame in his work with Northern Irish Republican and nationalist communities during the conflict and successfully draws comparison between the experiences of Muslims in Britain under Prevent and Republican communities here facing a Northern Irish state of exception with its special measures, including internment, emergency powers, deadlock courts, and so on. And his piece of work around that is called Counter-Terrorism or Counterproductive. Aaron Kunani in The Muslims Are Coming builds on Hilliard successfully to demonstrate how US and UK have similarly, following the same state imperative to counter terrorism, managed to homogenise disparate Muslim communities. There isn't, of course, a single Muslim community, but they've managed to manufacture a single Muslim community, mobilising state forces and virtually everyone else as well, again, so social workers, the school media, etc., in order to criminalise and surveil. So the same processes of manufacturing Muslims as a suspect community can also be seen in France, at least since the 1950s. And I suppose what I'm saying is, in the eyes of those three writers, and this is why I had difficulty framing it with the South of Ireland, these anti-terrorism imperatives are driven by an imperial or colonial need. In the case of France, it's since its war in Algeria in the 1950s. For the UK, France, and for the UK in the 70s, it was the Irish, including in the north of Ireland, and France and the USA since 9/11. It's Middle Eastern wars and the grab for Iraqi oil. The anti-terrorism legal media and popular discourses arises from a colonial imperative, is what I would say. And in fact, so Kunani then goes on to say that Islamophobia then becomes mainstreamed as a lay ideology in the US and France. Terrorism maps onto the colonial other, whereby imperial violence is then only ever proportionate and responsive to an inherently aggressive and threatening nature of a fanatical Muslim enemy. And you can sort of map that on to other groups. So what Kunani argues, and I think this is useful, is that Islamophobia is a structural feature of Western statecraft and capitalism, rooted in contemporary and historical colonial imperatives, which allows a disavowal of Western violence and of violence against minoritized groups. In other words, we're justified in brutalizing people. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelette. It's okay to kill people from minoritized groups or to ruin their lives. One point, I suppose the point I'm making is that in the south of Ireland, where is it? And what I would say is that in the south of Ireland, there are policy imperatives which other and turn groups into suspect communities. And there are policy, because of people's racialized background, and there are policy imperatives which turn people into suspect communities because of their political orientation or their resistance to the state. But they don't map onto each other in the same way that they do in that reading of suspect communities that I've just read out to you. But I'm actually here to be challenged about that, and Sheila pointed out that, in fact, in the case of Orgreave and Hillsborough, you can demonstrate very well that it does that. Working class white people are not racialized, but they are made into a suspect community. But so the first place that I think that the 26th county state does that is in the raft of policies that are hostile towards travellers, going back to and beyond the 1963 report of the Commission of Itinerancy, commissioned by the Free State, where the then junior minister, Charles J. Haughey, said in the introduction, infamously, there can be no final solution to the problem of itinerancy until they are absorbed into the general community. So 18 years after the Holocaust, travellers are presented as a problem for which a final solution needs to be found. And their distinctness, cultural practices, economic role or their role in the economy are invalidated and erased through a policy of forced sedentarism and criminalisation. And this has been the thrust of 26 county state policy towards travellers since right up until recently, the 2003 Housing Miscellaneous Act, which basically completely criminalised nomadism. You can't pull your trailer or caravan over onto the side of the road anymore. You get locked up for doing it. And you saw an enormous shift where something close to 60 or 70% of the travelling population still practice a nomadic lifestyle up to that point. And since then, it's now 60 or 70% of travellers now living in standard accommodation against their will. And you have all the health and mental health and suicide problems that go along with that. So that's one thing. And I can give you an example of the impacts of that on a colleague of mine just a couple of weeks ago. I have her permission to talk about her case. She's the director of the Travelling Project in Dublin. She was out and she sits with me on various committees, including some with on Garda Síochána, and she's worked very hard to try and get Gardaí to work in a sympathetic way towards members of her community. She was out with her extended family celebrating her grandson's birthday just before Christmas in a restaurant in South Dublin. And there were 40 members of the extended family, and they got a really shoddy service from the restaurant. Their food was really late arriving. In some cases it was 2.5 hours between the courses. The chips arrived and then their curry arrived, and it was cold and there was skin on it. So they complained, and they said this isn't good treatment. Now they're very used to trying not to be the troublesome traveller, right? So they complained in a very polite and straightforward way, and just making their case. And one of them had their camera on to record it because they knew that there might be accusations of something else. But the cops were called up, and 8 armed Gardaí arrived, and the woman and her son-in-law were arrested and handcuffed and taken down to the station using the Offences Against the State Act. I'm going to come to the Offences Against the State Act in a minute. And they were held in and they were jeered at by the guards, and there were accusations made at some of them. But that's today, and those are I suppose those are travellers who present and who manage to be respectable and to behave as like in a respectable way, and that's the impact on them. The second, I suppose, state impetus, which I think has the effect of manufacturing suspect communities, has its impetus in the state creation itself, in the emergency. And the 26 county state has, from its inception, similarly but not identically to its northern twin, been in a state of counterinsurgency, as you know, against Republicans, and in the language of the head against subversives, right? So, in the various iterations of the Offences Against the State Act, the Special Criminal Court, and a whole raft of practices such as the admissibility of Garda statements as evidence of guilt, the admissibility of uncorroborated confessions obtained through intimidation, coercion, and torture. I don't know if people have been watching the RTE series that just recently aired, a three-part series called Crimes and Confessions, about these practices in head gallery. If you haven't, I really recommend you go onto the RTE players and watch it. So, what I would say about that is that the other, in this case, is not also a racialized other. Do you know what I mean? It's that in this case, it is the subversives are people from the same ethnic group as the state is, right? So that's why I was kind of querying it. But what I would say is that it's still, if you come back to this sort of global Islamophobic ideology that is unleashed by what Aaron Kudnani describes in The Muslims of Kurm. You still get Islamophobia in the south of Ireland, and indeed, maverick billionaire Michael O'Leary made some very pugnacious comments calling for the profiling of Muslims just at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. I don't know if you remember that, but he was trying to do a Peter Casey and attract attention to Ryanair by saying, oh yeah, we're going to profile Muslims getting on flights. And then in the south of Ireland, like 17% of criminal attacks were against Muslims. But there are instances where, I know of a case where a schoolgirl wearing a veil getting off a bus was targeted by guards and searched just because she was wearing a veil. With no other reason. And I know, for example, that a friend, a trade unionist who had made numerous complaints to the guards about the Nazi lunatic Gemma O'Doherty and her racist pronouncements, said, are you going to arrest her under the Incitement to Hatred Act? She's been saying that Islamic State have a training camp in the Wicklow Hills, and the response from the guard was, how do I know that Islamic State don't have a training camp in the Wicklow Hills? So there is, and there are numerous studies into Garda culture, and there is a very high level of hostility towards all groups, people of African descent, Muslims, travellers, and Roma. Get it thick, and IDAR has ample data of the brutalisation, false imprisonment of all other groups. But what I would argue is that actually the targeting of these groups isn't because they are almost specifically intended to be the targets, as in the case of Britain, the US, and France, but because of the combination of a kind of a global racism and the culture that's been infused in the guards through the special criminal courts, that culture of imperviousness, of a lack of accountability, of we can get away with it, that culture of if you beat a confession out of somebody, then it'll stand up in court. If you assault somebody, so we have numerous cases of young black men in particular stopped on spurious traffic charges, who are assaulted, oftentimes strip searched, left naked or half naked in a cell, and only released if the sign an adult caution, which in law is effectively an admission of guilt, so there's no comeback on what's happened to them. So that's a pattern that happens again and again. And we know, sadly, in the case of Georgian Kenshall, who was shot by Gardaí 13 months ago to the day today in Blanchardstown, that there is the targeting of minoritized groups, racialized groups, I won't in that. Thanks very much. So what I'm saying is, I suppose to open up what I say is that in the 26 counties, at first reading, people from minoritized groups are not necessarily the focused or intended targets of these practices, but they in fact are because our accountability, human rights safeguards, and the application of the rule of law itself is so poor in a police and judicial system. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Shane. That was really interesting. As I said previously, our next speaker was due to be Gervais McCool, who is the local family member, and was going to speak on behalf of a family that collectively has been targeted by the PSNI and MI5, and is practical. Some of the things I mentioned in the introduction, how professionals have also targeted the families, social services, etc., and how that impacts on families. Unfortunately, Gervais is ill and can't be here, so instead Ronan Moyne from the Bloody Sunday Committee is going to speak in a personal capacity, but he is joined by Gervais' sister as well, so if there's questions afterwards. So thank you. Over to Ronan.
My name is Ronan Moyne. I'm a manager at a local police charity, and I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. Through my work, I would help a lot of targeted suspect families in the town deal with cases of vexatious claims to social services, vexatious claims for benefit fraud, and such alike. So I'm glad that I've been asked to actually voice what Gervais has put together. So again, now these are Gervais' words or not mine. My name is Gervais McCool. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my family, who have been collectively targeted by the state here in the 6 counties due to the perceived political opinions of members of my family. In 2019, Chief Constable of PSNI, Simon Byrne, released this statement. My message to them is, if you carry on doing this, we will have your house. If you keep going, we will have your cure. We will have your kids. We will have your benefits, and we will put you in jail. Long before 2019, some of my earliest memories were of PSNI officers invading my family home. Not understanding what was happening or why as a child, these grown adults had already decided that I was their enemy. The toxic attitude has always been there. It's always existed. But in the last 3 years since that statement was made by Simon Byrne, the PSNI have abused every ounce of power they have to attempt to make the lives of those they deem suspect hell. Beginning in May 2020, my sister Claire McCool experienced firsthand the new tactics the PSNI were adopting to punish those they deemed suspect. Access to her bank account was frozen with no explanation as to why. At this time, she had an 18-month-old son and was 6 months pregnant with another child. This bank account was her only means of getting access to her benefits, to feed, clothe and house her child, and to prepare for the child she was expecting. It served as an attack on the security of her household and the good start she wished to give to her infant and unborn child. After numerous meetings with the bank, 2 months later her account was reopened, the bank still offered no evidence as to why it was frozen, but did admit that it was ordered by an outside source. The bank acknowledged that every transaction was fully legal, and in their opinion there was no suspicious activity. After months of financial instability and stress, she could finally use her bank account again and access the welfare benefits she had a legal right to, benefits which included money for her young child. During this period, the bank had denied her access to the minimum level of benefits for food, housing and healthcare. The claimant's ability to access her money was short-lived, however, when again in September 2020, her bank account was once again frozen. Access to her funds was denied for a further 2 months, and on the 20th of December, 13 days before she was due to give birth, she was told she would no longer be able to bank with Santander. Having a child is supposed to be one of the most exciting times of a person's life. Can you imagine the stress and misery of wondering how on earth you're going to manage financially during the entire run-up to your child's birth, all because of what? Your second name, the area you come from, or your political beliefs? Despite there not being a single shred of evidence or accusation put to the precedent was set that the PSNI can decide whether you deserve to secure access to your income and your own money just like everyone else. That the protections awarded to each person can be taken away from someone like a single mother at the word of a PSNI member and their word alone. Guilty until proven innocent and then punished regardless. Simon Byrne spoke those words in 2019, and since the PSNI has carried out numerous violent house raids on family homes of those they deem suspect, including my family home. The legal right to enter isn't enough for the PSNI, who often burst out the door or saw through unlocked doors screaming and shouting to the point that they shake with adrenaline. Moving through the house, keeping children separated from parents and adults, and ignored every obligation and piece of guidance put in place to make these situations as safe as possible. In August 2020, the PSNI carried out one such raid on my home. They had been granted a warrant under the Betting, Gaming, Lotteries and Amusements NI Order 1985. I include this information as an example of the obscure legislation they often use depending on the likelihood of being granted a search warrant or not. During this raid, my brother, who was 14 years old at the time and who has autism, was attempting to make his way downstairs to the 3 adults in the property when he was physically picked off the ground and body slammed by a member of the PSNI. The officer then knelt on his back and another officer held his neck as they pinned him on the floor. They handcuffed him and removed him from the property. Despite being in our family home numerous times before and knowing he was a vulnerable minor, they once again separated him from every adult and put him handcuffed in the back of a police Land Rover. When her mother arrived at the property and pleaded with officers to tell where they were taking her underage son, she was told they had no idea of his whereabouts and had no way of finding out. In all reality, he had been kidnapped. Eventually, he was de-arrested outside our local police barracks, literally left at the side of the road after being physically attacked. 8 days after this event, my family received a letter from Social Services Gateway team saying they had received a referral regarding my brother from the PSNI and his safety. Not being satisfied with the fact they could physically abuse children with no consequence, the PSNI often used social service referrals as a way of mentally abusing suspect families and their children. Social workers are being harnessed as proxies in the PSNI's targeting of suspect families. The PSNI and the state which runs it is content making overworked, underfunded government bodies waste their time to try and keep true to the policy objective of the PSNI and Simon Byrne released in 2019. Making children feel unstable in their home by questioning their parents' ability to care for them. At times sending away enough referrals one after another that it triggers protocols, and schools are notified, further alienating families and shaming children. Without fail, social services write to these families as they wrote to my own and explain there is no need for their involvement and that they are satisfied with the care the child has received. The PSNI have proven time and time again that the main threat to these children and the children's safety is the PSNI themselves. Furthermore, there is no oversight. Those who stated that they would put matters in the PSNI have shown to be toothless and are complicit by their silence and their lack of action on this issue. Where will this end? Are we lurching towards a prevent-type strategy adopted against largely Asian, Black and Muslim communities in Britain? And this being brought into the 6 counties for those deemed politically unpopular? My family's experience isn't as unique as one would think. All over the 6 counties, there are families dealing with vexatious social services referrals concerning the welfare of their children, the freezing of their bank accounts, the seizure of their possessions, the seizure of their children's possessions, the suspension of their welfare benefits at the whim of PSNI officers with no oversight or challenge from Deirdre Hardy's Department of Communities who administer these benefits. Indeed, alleged benefit fraud cases have commenced against numerous individuals in this town and throughout the 6 counties, which when appealed and challenged are almost always successful, and in subsequent appeal hearings, the PSNI either fail to stand over their claims as they do not want to be cross-examined, or they simply state that the evidence gathered is secret and not in the national interest to disclose it. It is a farce, yet it effectively throws families into protracted periods of financial distress and upheaval, attacks their right to family life and privacy, and erodes and abuses their human rights. The reason I share these personal stories isn't for pity. I believe if we only speak in statistics, it is very easy to lose the human element of these problems. But for example, here's a statistic. It's alarming to hear that in the past equality impact assessment into the use of split hoods for the PSNI, it revealed that 81% of those on which a hood was used had a disability. But it's unfortunately not something that most people would know or want to discuss. I think it's important to remember that behind the facts and figures there are communities, families and individuals. Communities and families that, in these instances, are suffering simply because the PSNI have decided that they should suffer. When we allow the PSNI to abuse human rights in these ways, to use their powers unchecked, and to be unaccountable, we open the floodgates to corruption and for that to thrive. We unwillingly allow the precedent to be set that it's okay for them to punish people without evidence, that people can be targeted based on intelligence, that the PSNI are under no obligation to disclose to anyone at any time. I believe that we all have a joint obligation to speak up and fight for any person who finds themselves in a vulnerable position at the hands of the very structures that are supposed to be in place to protect them. Not just because one day it could be any of us, but simply because it's the right thing to do. What has happened to my family has happened to many others, as I've said. This treatment is designed to isolate and humiliate. It is designed to be hidden in the dark corners of our society, where those with the least power have no means to challenge their behaviours. For that reason, it needs to be exposed and brought into the light for all to see. It is wrong, it is a human rights abuse of citizens and children. It will cause untold damage to our society if it is allowed to continue. And I would like to thank the Voice Sunday March Committee for allowing us the platform to expose it.
Thank you, Ronan, for that and for reading out Gervais's words on behalf of the Cool family. And I think what it highlights really is, I saw Stafford notice the importance of testimony. We can have statistics which can be used and be important, but in order to really understand something, you just can't go beyond people's lived testimony and their experiences. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is someone I'm always honoured to be on a platform with or just in the company of, because he's someone who I have had huge respect for many years, and he is a well-known figure in Britain and beyond for his work in the black community and also family justice campaigns. Stafford Scott was a co-founder of the Broadwater Farm Defence Campaign in 1985. and since 1985 has been involved in so many campaigns that I don't count them. He's currently director of Tottenham Right CIC. As a race advocacy worker, he also previously led work on undercover policing at the monitoring group. I know Stafford and people have spoken here before from the monitoring group. The exposure of undercover police adds an even more sinister dimension to the state repression Stafford has devoted himself to opposing, with campaigns being infiltrated and undermined by officers. So I'd like to hand you over to Stafford Scott.
Great to be here again after not being able to travel and be with you after so many years. My name's Stafford Scott. I come from a place called Tottenham in North London, built on an estate called Water Farm. Some of you may have heard about it. It was a pretty notorious place in the 80s. You know about Water Farm? Yeah? You know about Tottenham, okay? And you'll know about it because we've been singing. We've got a football team there, you probably won't know about it, we're a football team. We're not doing that great. We're known because we're a suspect community. We've been a target community. We're a community that resists and fights back. So that's why our name is often known. I used to say, from Hallwell Farm to the box side, when I first started to come here. And on the box side, growing up as a young child, and the target community was a suspect community. We were taught in England to suspect people who had voices and intonations and sounded like the people that I've heard on this platform today. Just like people who are being educated and trained and taught that I'm a suspect from a suspect community because of the colour of my skin. So in many senses, what I'm talking today is about how people have become suspect communities because they look like me or they sound like me. And it's not by no accident. It's not by accident. It's not by accident that this is happening. Recently, my daughter Kamara and I, we put on an exhibition in London at the ICA. We called it A War in a Babylon. And we spoke about Babylon as being this place, it's imperialism. That's what we were talking about, a war against imperialism. And we started off the exhibition with a quote from someone you should all know pretty well. His name was Kenneth Newman. You remember that man? Yeah? No?
Yes.
You know why you're going to remember him? Because you sent him over to us, right? We exported him, we imported him. And this is what he said in 1982. He was brought to England in 1980 by Margaret Thatcher after 1981, after the uprisings in Brixton and other cities in England. So he was brought to police those target communities. And it wasn't enough that black people faced institutional racism. When he came to England, he brought with him techniques that he'd learned and developed here. So one of the first things he did was speak about the Jamaicans. And I need to warn you all that my parents are from Jamaica. So he was speaking about people not only who look like me, but have the same ethnicity. And this is what he said. In the Jamaicans, you have a people who are constitutionally disorderly. It's simply in their makeup. They're constitutionally disposed to being anti-authority. So we put that up on the wall, and we need to educate and teach our community. Because some in our community think that we're the only ones who suffer from such oppression. And that's one of the techniques that they're able to deliver and make people feel that what's happening to us is kind of unique. So we all suffer the same things in different times. And what we wanted to do was educate our community about where our oppression came from. So we started with that statement, and then we wanted everyone to understand who he was. The fact that he'd been brought over from here to England to bring a certain style of policing. And what we explained to people was about that style of policing. It was a style of policing that the English had never really seen. It was a style of policing that was developed on the continents of Africa, Asia, and developed here. It was a style of policing that was about enabling the colonialist to identify and target those who might resist them. There's a style of policing, because on the continent, you might have the Mau Mau, for example, in Kenya, who were thinking to themselves, we don't want these lovely English people in our country no more, we'd like our land back. That's not the kind of thought processes that was happening in England. So they created a style of policing that would allow them to target large groups and large swathes of people. Here, when he talks about the Jamaicans, what he's really saying to British society is, you see these groups of black people, we're going to deal with them in a way that is different to the way that we deal with you. We're going to do it because they're suspect. We can't prove all the time what the crimes that we actually accuse them of, because they're so devious. They're masterminds in their criminality, their terrorism. So what we'll do is we'll treat the whole entire community as suspect. In the north of Ireland, we know who they treat as suspect. It was those who happened to be Republicans and happened to be Catholic. So this man, Newman, brought that style of policing over to England, and they used that against my community to create institutionally racist processes and policies to treat us exactly in the way that Ronan has just described that family being treated. It's an experience that we've had ever since the Windrush landed in the UK, in England, and before. But the experience, they keep on building on it. Every time we have the temerity to stand up and rise up, we have another iteration. I came here first, I think it was in 2012 or 2013, as a representative of the Mark Duggan Justice Campaign. You all remember Mark Duggan, right? They murdered that young man, just as they've murdered many people in this country here. They murdered him, covered it up, using the techniques that they'd learned here. But in Tottenham, we were peeved, so we went to the police station, and it led to a demonstration that then led to an uprising. Uprising that then spread across the whole entire country. And when they saw this spread across the country, when they saw young people being politicized for the first time in their life, they needed to come up with a way to stop it. So what they did, if you remember, when they forced Boris Johnson and Cameron to come back from their holidays, do you remember? They were off on their holidays, they didn't want to come back, they got forced back, and when they arrived back, they said, oh, this is another classic case of othering. When they got back, they said, oh, those riots were created by the gangsters. You know that, right? And they had to say this because they didn't want us to look at the social economic drivers that made young people in Salford respond in the same way as young people in Tottenham to the oppressive nature of the state, to a state that doesn't invest in young people, doesn't care about young people. So what they did is they came and they created the gangsters as the bogeymen. They blamed it all on the gangsters. Nothing to do with cost, nothing to do with austerity, those criminal-minded people. The gangsters. You heard that, right? Right. And we've been hearing it ever since. In 2012, now these names you need to remember. Boris Johnson. You heard that name? Yeah, that's our fault. Right? London has to take responsibility for the fact that Boris Johnson is now the Prime Minister of the UK. We have to take responsibility, but somehow we allowed him to become Mayor of London. Right? A lot of skulldog when misbehaving out, he did it, but he didn't. And when he did it, this is what he did. He created a thing called a gangs matrix. When they said that the gangsters were responsible for the riots in 2011, there was 4 reviews, including the Metropolitan Police's own review, which was called 4 Days in August, which categorically denied that gangsters had organised these uprisings. But Boris Johnson didn't stop there. Theresa May, you've heard of when they created the hostile environment, you've heard of that recently? That they created the hostile environment for those black people whose passports they took away. Even that's a manipulation of reality, because it implies that at some time it wasn't a hostile environment in England for black people. It's always been a hostile environment for black people in England. They just turn it up every now and then. At the same time that she was creating the hostile environment for the Windrush generation, she gave Boris Johnson additional powers as the Mayor of London to deal with the gangs that didn't even exist. And I'm going to prove to you that the gangs didn't exist. But I'm going to ask you all a question. Who can name me one of the gangs that's purportedly causing all this criminality in London at the moment? Who can give me the name of one London gang?
Conservative Party.
The Conservative Party. The Conservative Party and the police. But here we are, 10 years down the line, and they still haven't named the gang. They're still talking about the harms that gangs are causing in our community, in our society. They can't name a gang. You know names of gangs in America, right? Right? We know about the Bloods. You've heard about that, haven't you? You've heard about the Crips. These gangs actually have names. But in England, they're fighting gangs that they haven't even spoken about. They created a database where they told us that they put the names of the most violent gangsters on the database. And I was fortunate enough to be handed a copy of the database by a disgruntled police officer. On the database that I had, it was for the area I come from, it's called Hilliard. Now everyone knows that, who knows Hilliard, the biggest gang in Hilliard, outside of the police, the Tory party doesn't have no respect for Hilliard. Outside of the police is a Turkish gang called the Tottenham Turks. So when we got this database and had a look at it, we were surprised to see that there was only one Turkish boy's name on there. 99 of the 100 names on there were black. When we looked at this database, what we saw was that they created these young kids. Red for really bad, amber for not so bad, and green who are actually just the friends of those who are in amber. Guilt by association. They put them on this database and then they police them in the most draconian, most oppressive fashion. The behaviors that Roland spoke about, that's an everyday police attitude towards our young people. The work of social services and other government agencies to deprive these young people of services and assistance and support is amazing. They love to work with social services, try to get women to kick partners out of the home on their say-so. And if women then follow what they do, then they put in social services to come and do their jobs. We've got these young kids on this database who they're taking away all of their driving licenses because the police are working with the DVLA, saying that these young people are unfit to drive because they smoke copious amounts of weed. Now, I'm not a driver and I wouldn't want to be on the road with people who were stoned under copious amounts of weed. But people have driving licenses to drink, right? It doesn't mean you're a drunk driver. They're taking away all of their services, all provision from them. They've done this database. They share this information with job centres, with councils, with schools and benefit offices. And all of these people withdraw services from these young people. We put in a complaint. We work with Amnesty International. Amnesty International wrote a report called Trapped in the Matrix, and we put in a complaint to the Information Commissioner's Office. The Information Commissioner's Office sits above government, and they were able to investigate the police. And when they investigated what the police did in creating this racialized database, they said, oh gosh, that's how they're speaking. Oh gosh, look what they've done. They've broken all privacy, all data, and equality legislation in setting up this database. In creating a database where there's going to target predominantly young black people across London, they've broken every single rule in the book. And they did it because they've othered these groups, and they know that mainstream society won't look at them to see how they're treating these people that they've already defined as criminals. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, was so aghast at what the Metropolitan Police had done that they actually put them in special measures. I don't know if you heard about it here, you probably didn't, because you know the police and the media are very friendly. So they don't tell these kind of stories. But for the Metropolitan Police Service to be put in special measures, this was just 2 years ago, following on from Stephen Lawrence and the uproar that we had with them. It is quite amazing. The reason why I've gone back to talk about this behaviour is because the ICO First of all, they found them guilty of breaking all legislation, then they put them under special measures, and then they said, we're going to do another investigation, because we're going to investigate what happens when the police works with a third party or works with another agency. Again, following what Ronan has just told you about what's been happening to this family, the ICO said that the police, when they work with a third party, they do so with the intent of causing harm and distress to their targets. Now, why this is really important is because this database that they had, which contained 2,800 names on it, we forced them to remove 1,350 of those names, which is almost 45%. Thank you. It's really significant. But the point is, 45% of the young people who was on there had never committed a violent offence in their lives. They were being policed in a manner and a style that was going to make it more likely that through the marginalisation that came as a result of being on this database, they were more likely to join gangs and become violent and to use violence, because we all know young people who get bullied ultimately become bullies themselves. And this is the state that is bullying young people. The reason why this is really important is because at the moment there's a bill going through Parliament. It's called the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. You'll be aware of that. And in that bill, there is legislation that seeks to target and cover certain groups. That would be protesters, gypsies, roamers and travellers, as we've already said. They're going to curtail their rights. Most notably an attack on gypsy Roma communities who now face further stigma and isolation, criminalisation, as unauthorised encampments will be deemed a criminal offence under the bill. But within it, there's also a duty to prevent serious violence. Now again, we've heard about the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It then changed to the Prevent Act. It was Prevention of Terrorism for communities that sounded like yours. It was the Prevent Act for communities that look like ours. And now there's this duty to prevent serious violence. And what it is the government is turning agencies, departments and their partners into snoops and spies. Youth workers, teachers, doctors and other service providers will be compelled to pass on information to the authorities regarding even the most benign adolescent misbehaviour. Behaviour that maybe we may have done when we were young, and probably you're not as old as me, but when we were young and growing up, that normally we'd have a youth worker come around to try and support us and help us and educate us out of it. Young people will now be criminalised as a result of it. They plan to create a new civic order, a serious violence reduction order, which will hand the police extraordinary powers to stop and search people anytime, any place, completely free of suspicion, and it's a return to the substance. They're going to be criminalising young people, further marginalising already marginalised communities, denying us the rights to protest about their boss, and most importantly, they're going to discriminate against people that look like me and sound like me. Thank you.
Brilliant, and also just to say in relevance to the last points that Stafford was making about the police crime sentencing bill, in relation to us in Hillsborough, there is this supposed Hillsborough law going through which actually is supposed to be about not just the police but public agencies having a duty of candour to tell the truth. I'm not a big fan of it because what it does, to me, it's codifying corruption. It's actually saying, well, these public servants, these public authorities who should be axiomatic that they tell the truth and are accountable. The fact you've got to introduce another layer of law says to me it's entrenching corruption in society. But the point relevant to Stafford's comment is the other week in kind of what I termed a vanity project by some Labour mayors and politicians, there was a big event actually in Manchester to campaign for this Hillsborough law to be enacted. And the very same day, call me cynical and bloody-minded, but Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, actually showed an amendment. This is Labour, to the Police and Crime and Sentencing Bill, to incorporate Hillsborough law into the police crime sentencing, and nobody said a word about it. Our campaign has been up in arms going, what's going on here? You are bringing this, half-decent law. You are trying to make this police crime sentencing bill acceptable by using Hillsborough, and the people who were complicit in that should be ashamed of themselves. And we have raised it, and no one will say it, so it's very relevant what is being said. Before I introduce the next speaker, I'm sorry for interrupting, but this is important in terms of what's going on. Betty Doherty, if Kate Nash is in the building, this is a message. Would you take care, and if Liam is around, would you take them over to the wall for 20 past? And and Bubbles?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry Bubbles, but yeah, would you do that? Because we're here, yeah? Yep. Please, so. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Apologies for that. R5, this is what I love about, ongoing and live campaigns. The spontaneity's great, isn't it? All the better plans go, and someone's messaging me, whatever, it's important. Our final speaker is Sean McGrady from Participation and Practice of Rights in Belfast. Sean is the Assistant Director of Programmes at Participation and Practice of Rights, PPR. PPR puts the power of human rights at the service of those who need it most, supporting marginalised people to assert their rights in practical ways and make real social and economic change in their communities. Located in Belfast, PPR supports groups in using the organisation's human rights-based approach to tackle the issues challenging them. The groups launch campaigns which measure success when change is seen on the ground, not when government makes a commitment. So, over to Sean. Thank you.
Are you okay, yeah? Okay, there's where I got me the microphone. Listen, Jessica, council for four, or me the microphone, Scott, so I guess that is a great man, so by Mr. Gasta. I'd be quick because I'm sure he's going to have a bit of a chip in at some stage. I'm Sean McBrady, I work for PPR and I'm an organiser. We have a community organising model which uses human rights tools to organise campaigns with people impacted by human rights abuse, which most of the social and economic rights layers aren't really considered as such. It's usually, when you talk about human rights abuse, people usually think prison, death, and so on. But that layer of social and economic rights, which is essential for all existence, is the layer we operate in. So our organisation was established by Ines McCormick, who was big in the civil rights movement, was a social worker in Ballymurphy, where I live, when she was growing up and cut her teeth. She came from a unionist, Protestant, middle class or upper class maybe background, and through political education in her job probably as a social worker, and then in the early days of the civil rights movement became a key campaigner for rights and equality here in the north. So she was part of the McBride principles, the Good Friday Agreement, negotiations and cajoling and everything else. She was the first female president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions in a very patriarchal institution. She was the creator of PPR, and she and others like her always had this notion that rights are fantastic if you have power, because you can have them if you have power, but if you don't have power, you don't have rights. So what we do is we try to find methods by which to organise those whose rights are being denied, to build power, and for the most part to disrupt current power and create pathways to solutions. So they have to be instant and they have to be long term. There's no point going into the New Lodge tower blocks in North Belfast 10 years ago when we started organising and given a big lecture about religious inequality and housing provision rooted in sectarian discrimination of a partition state that's 100 years old, and yada, 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 yada. The organising principle for us is you hear the problem from the people impacted. So when you rap a door and someone answers and they tell you there's shit coming up through the sink and there's damp up in the corner, that's the human rights issue. So we organise on that principle and always have. The people themselves are the best, are the experts on the situation they face, and probably the experts on the solution that's required. So, housing, social security, asylum, rights of travellers, a whole range of different social and economic rights categories. We've remolded this model over the last 10 or 15 years in different situations. Started in North Belfast and North Dublin, and have actually rolled it out in 3 jurisdictions: so Edinburgh, Cork, Dublin, Belfast, across a whole range of rights categories. But I was going to concentrate on a wee story of one campaign, the Right to Work, Right to Welfare group, which is the connection between myself and Roland. Roland's a superhero by day, superhero by night, to the welfare advice. And a superhero by day. But that's why I become involved in this conversation today, because his organisation actually, and the way that he works in the advice sector, has given a lot of power to very, very powerless human beings in a really, really oppressive institutional framework for suppressing rights and taking strength away from the most vulnerable in our society: the sick, the disabled, and the unemployed, largely women and children. So the work that he does is like defensive work after the horse is bolted, to fight constantly to get back to a point where people started. So people have had their income threatened, taken away, families who are feeding their children in the food banks are left in that situation because of a culture, and I've heard culture mentioned a few times, a culture that has been created in the aftermath of the banking crisis, 2008, right through until now, to prosecute an austerity agenda. A culture has been created of, and it's widespread, and it's accepted, and it's probably a lot of the people in this room and a lot of the communities you live in probably accept a large portion of this culture, that there's a bunch of scrounging, no good fuckers out there, and that they're living off your back, and that they need to be not only a suspect community, they need to be policed out of existence. So that's the culture in the welfare system. And only recently, probably in COVID, when we all became welfare recipients, when we all got furloughed, when we all got, the vast majority of the population became dependent upon the welfare state rather than the lesser amount before the COVID crisis. But only in this recent 2 years has it become so apparent how important a welfare state is and how everybody is a beneficiary of it. So hopefully I can change some of that culture. But the culture we started in 5 or 6 years ago, organising Right to Work, Right to Welfare, was very much the culture of there's a bunch of scrounging fuckers out there, and they need to have every penny ripped off them in a culture of continuous surveillance and suspicion. And that culture we started to challenge by starting outside the Dole office in Corporation Street and collecting stories. And part of our resistance to human rights abuse, or our resistance to attacks on human rights, is to flip the coin on it, is to flip the lens, so that the person who's the suspect begins to become the monitor. So the person who is having their rights denied can flip that relationship onto power and begin to monitor and publish and shine a light on their behaviour. And really interesting stuff happens when you start to do that. Really interesting reactions happen in power when you start to say, I'm monitoring you and your performance as per existing international human rights obligations. When you start to have those conversations, the woman who is disabled and is getting brought into the Capita office to be assessed for the 3rd time in 3 years by a former paramedic who hasn't got any of the skills to understand her conditions, mental or physical. when that woman flips that, and a human rights monitor is in the room, monitoring the person who's assessing her, monitoring how they're behaving, recording their behaviour with a view to reporting it on the lines or to sharing light on it another way. It creates a really interesting, and if you're like me and you're a bit mischievous, a really enjoyable dynamic where the powerless can develop power, but that can only happen with allies. That woman can't do that alone. She can't do it unless there are allies, and there are people that are willing to stand beside her, people like Ronan, people like other institutions and organisations that are willing to say, it is absolutely 100% correct that she shines that lens back, and she shines that light back on that person who is ticking the 15 boxes as to whether or not she'd get pittance to bring home to feed her family. And so them dynamics we shift all the time and get wins. I mean, we've been in other cases, because usually the Department for Communities think, oh shit, these are going to take a judicial review, or this is going to be in the front page of a paper, so sort that one out. So the story of that campaign, to fast forward it, was really, really quickly. We began on Corporation Street, the old office, maybe 5 to 6 years ago, surveying and then producing the results. The first campaign that the group ran was Real Jobs Now, and it forced Belfast City Council to start creating jobs for the long-term unemployed within 12 months. That was great, but at the same time, there were sanctions, welfare cuts, new punitive regimes coming in around how to assess people for the ESA and migration. So people are doing real jobs, like Real Jobs Now, so we're getting our money stamped left, right and centre. So the next campaign was for a human rights checklist to be introduced by the Department for Communities, where civil servants who made these decisions would check 5 boxes. Existing legal standards. This is the rules that are already meant to be the framework under which the state operates. And that campaign has secured the support of every political party, every trade union, who else? A couple of other couples, right? But a popular support. But has it moved 1 inch in the civil service? No. So about 2 years ago, this campaign of people who are sick, disabled and unemployed brought all that momentum to the Lord Mayor of Belfast, who was at the time Deirdre Hargey, the current Minister for the Department for Communities. And the Lord Mayor of Belfast backed the campaign just like the previous Lord Mayor of Belfast had, whilst the campaign was en route to monitor the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Communities. So there's about 15 of us, wheelchairs and walking sticks, women and children and all sorts of, and we're going to the Department for Communities to speak to the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Communities and present evidence of human rights failings in the social security system that were causing real harm. I mean, illness, mental illness, poverty. When we started surveying Corporation Street, there was 1 food bank in Belfast, and now there's a food bank in every district in Belfast. So these harms, these deep harms and weights and scale and spread harms are being perpetrated over and over and over again by functionaries of the state. Not bad people, but just functionaries at different levels within the civil service or within the private sector that's been hired by the civil service. So when we meet the Permanent Secretary, and we plotted it out beforehand, right, what are we going to do when we meet this Permanent Secretary guy? Who is he? His name is Leo O'Reilly. Where's he from? I don't know. He owns land, and he's, you know, what will he know about our struggles? What will he know about being on the brew 72 quid a week? And what will he know about those things? Absolutely nothing. So what we've done, instead of going in and having a yes sir, no sir, do you mind sir kind of meeting, the 15 people who were around the table, meeting Leo O'Reilly and the civil servants just underneath them, done a reverse assessment of him. So they had their 15 questions, their checklist. One of the questions was, Leo, how did you get here today? He asked me how I got here today. I was driven, you know, and people were going, yeah, because we get asked that all the time. But the next one was something in relation to the rights, and then on down the line it was, and tells us, Theo, can you stand on one leg? And up he gets. That known as one leg, which is a question that was put to a woman who was sitting in a wheelchair facing him the days before when her benefits were stopped. So, in flipping that with him, what you've seen as well was how divorced from the reality of the policies that his department implemented, that the most senior civil servant was. And all of those people around that table on that day, days later, hundreds of pounds and thousands of pounds were in bank accounts. And that had nothing to do with them being right. It had nothing to do with them having proof. It had nothing to do with them telling the truth. It had to do with the fact that they took on and flipped power a bit, just a bit. And that's a lesson that we take from PPR and from all of our organisations. It's not being right. It's not knowing that there's a problem and repeating it over and over again. But it's about developing meaningful, immediate tools for the powers to take on and flip power back again. And that's really, really, really hard. And there's a lot of processes that will fail, and ultimately all the processes that currently exist aren't about delivering on human rights. They're really about containing grievance. They're really about suppressing the capacity of suspect communities to actually get justice. And a lot of these processes are really, really difficult to navigate. Sometimes it shouldn't be at all. This should be about flipping the table on its head and going in a different direction. And that's what we try to do. We try to create those frameworks to enable people to create their own systems to become the human rights monitor and not be the suspect anymore, but the whole suspicious behaviour accountable. And I think the people in the bloody Sunday families, who else in this world would have told that story better and held the British state accountable than the bloody Sunday family? We live in a world where all of us know for an absolute fact that the British government were able to massacre civilians and then call them terrorists for 50 years when it was untrue. But we live in a world where that isn't true to us, because we know because of the actions of those families that that was untrue and knew it the entire time. And I think there are examples like that. As much as there's a hostile environment towards refugees and asylum seekers who we work with and are living on 37 quid a week, as much as there's a racial profile environment for travellers, as much as there's everybody's a dissy who doesn't believe in the discourse environment, there's also hospitality and hospitable environments and kind economics everywhere. Solidarity and mutual aid, that is the resistance to all of that balance. And I think that we can embrace a lot of that moving forward as well and learn lessons from no better lessons than we learned from what the bloody Sunday family. We're going to market.
Brilliant, I love it, but we're back to the thing, aren't we, of the power of testimony and controlling the narrative and how important that is. Can I check that people have any time for questions?
Yeah.
You're ready for questions, yeah? So what we'll do then, if people can show their hands, is there a microphone or are people just going to shout? Yeah? But you can come up here if you want to use the mic. We'll take a few questions at a time. If you want to direct it to one particular speaker, could you please say? So could we have a show of hands if anybody would like to ask a question?
Community can talk about asking for community as well. And it's not just in very overt ways, such as obviously Pat Newman and his murder, but it's been done much more subtly by denial of funding for organisations like Rose works for, using the local legal mechanisms to try and guide advocacy organisations. So I wanted to know if anybody wants to talk about that.
It's a really interesting question that, you know, I mean, I won't, but I can speak from my personal experience around that, of how you're targeted as an individual and really maligned because of work that you're doing. But I think somewhat, yeah, I think the issue around funding cuts, the revision is crucial. So, Brendan, yeah.
And actually, can be more personal than that. Every stop and search on numerous occasions coming from people that have been trying to help because of my interaction with those people. So like, I work 9 to 5, I travel to people's homes to try and assist them, and I'm leaving certain people's homes, I get stopped and searched because I am now suspect because I'm helping them in the budget. So it's not just a case of they can target cutting, but that is an issue. The work that we have with Sean, I have to be careful because I'm not in personal capacity. You know, we have to be mindful. In our organisation, you have to be mindful that if you're a charity and you're receiving government funds, but you have to be careful that there is certain lines, and if you cross them, then you're not able to, as a charity, continue to provide this help and support that is essential for the people on the ground. So there is a certain line that you may want to cross, but the reality is that other people that you're helping will be negatively impacted by you crossing that line. So you know, that's just the nature of charities and the way they're funded. But what I would say to people who are impacted, people who work in charities by their very nature are usually very sympathetic, good-hearted people. And if you're looking for allies, that's where you'll find the allies. People will want to help, will want to go over and above for people who are in minority communities or targeted. I know I would feel like that, but it is a case that the state will target applicants as well.
We've got a real luxury in PPR in a way where we don't take state funding. They're the most human rights organisations, well, neither do a lot of human rights organisations for fear of even it being interpreted that the state can manipulate their agenda. But in our interactions, in three, I talk about it's got 3 different jurisdictions, north and south of the border in Ireland and in Scotland. Every single place that we have operated and you build new power, you come into conflict with old power or the relationship between power and existing civil society. And that's ubiquitous. It happened in Edinburgh when we were organising people in Leith and shitty car blocks, and eventually the council will pull the strings of funding on the organisations on the ground. It happened in Cork, and it happens regularly in all of our interactions with civil society organisations. And that doesn't mean that those organisations don't want to go far. They have upper limits, and there's something to be thought about there in our community organising as well for the future. The upper limits of existing state-funded relationships are something to be challenged. Maybe we just have to create wee orbits outside those organisations where it's safer to meet the challenge, and that's kind of what we try to do too.
Thanks. Any other questions? We've got a microphone at the ready now. Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment, thanks to all the speakers, but it's the comments about power and structures and coming through COVID and out of COVID. And I can sympathise with what was said about people working charities and the limitations. I work within a charity, but my particular project gets funded from a bigger organisation over in England, so very fluid. And we kind of sit in the margins, but equally we're dealing with people who are marginalised. It's a training programme that I provide, and more than ever now, coming out of COVID, the concept of power and structures needs to be discussed right down at grassroots level, and who has power and how do you get power and how is your power taken away or given away, and why are systems set up and who set them up and for whose benefits were they set up, and that idea of now we need to challenge, and it's not a bad thing to challenge. you have a right to challenge, but equally some people give you a respectable right to challenge, you know, and sometimes people think going out in the streets is, you know, a last resort, or going out in the streets is actually a very legitimate way of protesting, you know, and the whole idea of people need to be sitting down at grassroots levels now and discussing power, how to take it back, all this collective organisation, what rights you have. Non-violent direct action is now, you know, is a way to go. You don't have to sit within a system and be respectable. So it's just to say that. And I know the limits. I mean, if you have to get funding, then you're very limited in what you do. And I also work with environmental groups here, and the environmental groups, local grassroots people, are the independent environmental protection agency that hasn't and never existed in the north. And people were saying years ago, you know, we don't have one now because Arlene Foster years ago said, no, we're not having it. So if you have to rely on an assembly and ministers to give you the okay in order to have an independent agency, well then it's not independent because you're relying on that funding and you can only go so far. So like other people, my funding is a wee bit different, so I can step to the side. So, but now more than ever, we need to start talking about power and taking it back.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, does anybody want to comment on that? Or, yeah, very valid point. Any other questions? Yeah, do you want the mic?
I'm an Irish Republican. I'm sitting here with an electronic tag on my ankle. I'm curfewed for 9 o'clock. I'm restricted to who I can speak to and who I can't. I'm just wondering what tactics or strategies that people in Tottenham have for highlighting the issues, especially when they're faced with a compliant media, compliant judiciary, who follow the line of criminalisation, felon sin.
The tact of this meeting is there is no British justice. What we say in Tottenham is there is no justice, there's just us. And that's who we rely on, and that's who we try to support. And what I try to do as a community representative from Tottenham is to see who just us is, to see if we can go out and start to develop relationships with others, especially people who don't look like me or sound like me, so that you can talk about my struggle and I can talk about your struggle, and those who are in power can actually see that they're not dividing us, because this is all about divide and rule, isn't it? You know, our histories tell us about, we've all been, you know, Irish people, black people have been victims of imperialism. Imperialism isn't over. Fascism is imperialism turned inwards. We're in a country where it's run by Boris. I mean, they're the imperialists. He was only elected and voted in to get us away from Brexit. Imperialism. And now what he's done is he's turned that inward on people like us. We have to find ways that we come together, that we engage, and that we stand together in the most visible of ways. And that other people know that we're actually the 99% and we shouldn't allow the 1% to run the show. And that's what we try to do in Tottenham, is to remind people that morally and principally what we do is right, even if we don't have the power and if we're punished for trying to do that. And I'm sorry about the time.
Yeah, I think, you know, the comment you make is so important. For those of us who live in England, it really is the thing, the level of ignorance about over here is immense. I mean, most people would not believe that you're sitting there today and what you just said, because they think it's all over, everything's over, everything's fine over here. And that brings in what you said around the media, because people in England aren't told that, or they're just fed the stereotypical issues, you know, historically. And in that sense, nothing's really changed. And it is only about what I find increasingly that it's just, my world has got smaller. That, you know, from thinking I could change the world, I just now think, oh, if I can make a little difference in the community in which I live, then I'm getting somewhere. And I never thought I would think so small, in one sense it's quite depressing, but it's heartbreaking, it's heart-wrenching, yes. So, any other questions? Yes, and then Phil. So.
It's just a statement. I work at Brixton Underground Station on trading the youths in Brixton are quite glad down there to start to search them. Everyone's got a mobile phone and start doing it. And they're actually keyed up on law, keyed up on rights, and there's a whole group of them that go around, and as soon as the police pounce on someone, they're there and they're filming and they're broadcasting it online, and it's the only way to protect them, because as a safety net, and I keep up all the time, because the police are putting the public in danger by doing these exercises at the top of the stairs of Brixton, which puts everyone in danger, everything. The police go away afterwards and leave the staff there, which is putting us all under risk and all vulnerable. So I think that's a tactic that I think is fantastic, especially when they do change the laws, make the sus laws go back again. That's the only way to do them every single time. Get your phones out, filming live on Facebook and stuff like that. That's a tactic I think is fantastic. And I come from here. I left here as a child, so I know both sides.
Thanks very much. Phil?
I was going to say so, no, Brixton. Again, I work in the station in Brixton and I'm a uni rep, but I've known Sheila for many years. Every time the police come through and do an operation, we can play straight away. And one of our drivers, a few months back, one of the train drivers, was in the winter, like I think, whenever it was, he got off the train, he put his jacket on, so he walked up the escalators, and the police were doing an operation. It's a black lad. No, he's not young enough, and the police stopped him and went, what are you doing? And he went, what? And he went, we want to search you. And he was in work, right? He just got off a train and he was coming for his break. Because he had a jacket on, he didn't see his uniform. And he went, what do you mean you want to search me? And he went, what do you want to search me for? And he said to him, you look suspicious. So he kicked off, right? He starts kicking off on the police, and we were all there. Well, I wasn't in that day, but that just emphasises one thing. But like I said, when the police come and do these operations in Brixton, we stand there, and the police are there. We see what they do. They'll just stop young black lads of a certain age all the time. But like I said, these kids are not stupid, because if we're working in the next station in Stockwell, all of a sudden you'll see loads of young black lads coming through, and I'll just go like this to someone on WhatsApp. The police did an operation in Brixton. I said, oh, the kids are coming through Stockwell, it's only half a mile away. But the police just target these kids all the time. They're not targeting for any reason other than the age and what colour they are. And like we complain about it all the time. Because like we say, we're there 24 hours a day. Once the police are gone, they create this awful atmosphere in the community. And the only people that are still there in uniform, even though it's not police uniform, is us. But we complain about, so we said, look, we can deal with the problems because we're in that community. We can deal with the kids, we don't want the police there, so we deal with this on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Phil. I think what the importance of that is, those two last contributions, is the value of workers being organised, because as you say, when the police come, you ring the police and complain about the police behaviour. So that interaction between the young people that are stopping and the informed staff is so important, but that's down to you being aware and organised, and that's the value of sort of good trade unions. So yeah, and it all fits in with what Sean was saying. Really, it's turning it all the time and throwing it back at them. So, any other questions? Yes.
There's one thing that I can't understand and frustrates me. I know we have a local government here in Northern Ireland that represent us in Westminster, etc. But the problem is that if you look at all the major decisions, even for Northern Ireland, they're made in Westminster. They're decided by the British government, such as the benefit system, such as the bedroom tax, everything. It's all decided by the British government. It's also decided by the British government this immunity thing that's been brought on, where nobody can be prosecuted for what happened on Bloody Sunday. That's all decided by the British government. yet we don't have any say or any vote in voting in the British government. That to me is ludicrous, because they make the decisions for us here, yet we have no say here in who we want and how they actually run the country. I mean, that is, it's crazy.
I think that's a whole other event, isn't it? And contribution, yeah. Sean, and then we'll make Sean the last speaker. Last contribution.
Yeah, I appreciate where you're coming from, and I agree. I mean, I think that Westminster shouldn't be making laws determining what people's lives are like here. But Stormont actually make a lot of decisions. I mean, for example, they voted on welfare reform that has crushed communities here right across the north. We're talking about racism. I mean, on the 5th of June 20th, or 5th of June 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protest happened in this city, it wasn't Westminster that decided they organised a huge crackdown, fining people, threatening to prosecute. That's Stormont, and what Stormont is doing is imitating what Westminster is doing.
That's because of the DUP's basically Boris Johnson's puppet.
No. I think it's, well, I wish it was just the DUP, but I actually think it's all 5 of the Stormont parties, in the sense that there's a 5-party government, and they all voted they all agreed with the crackdown on Black Lives Matter. And so they've all taken responsibility for that. So I think the thing is, absolutely, laws for the North of Ireland shouldn't be decided in Westminster, but there's lots of things where Stormont actually has the ability to go against Westminster, and they choose not to. And it's not just the DUP. So I look, that's why I think we have to fight for an alternative to what Stormont gives us. And there'll be a lot of discussion on it. Thank you.
But Stormont has gone against the community, so...
Thank you for that, thank you. Well, can I just ask any of the speakers if they just want to sum up in 2 minutes? You've all been very patient, so we'll start just at the end. Raymond, do you want to say anything? John?
I'm speaking for Gervais. But just one point that I'd like to see this here, we work with people coming in Hilliard. All these practices are designed, they turn working people against each other. It's all designed for the people who are working and trying to make a living, they turn on their fellow citizen, right? Until we have a radical unionised workforce that can actually go and say to their bosses, we are not going to turn on our fellow citizens, we're not going to turn on our neighbour, we're not going to be part of proxies and the PSNI's policy objectives, then you're not really going to change this. And I think that there's a massive need for a radicalised workers' union in this city, across the 6 counties, and the 26 counties, and further afield.
I just want to thank the organisers and everybody here for being here, and I really want to thank the fellow panellists. I feel very humbled listening to the lived experiences of so many people. Ronan, your own experience as well as Gervais's. Sean, I'm so excited by the work that PTR does, and so just thrilled with that idea of flipping power and your clarity to them. And Stafford, I've always been in all of the work and the management group and the clarity with which you explain the experience of your community. I'm very humbled. So thanks very much.
Thanks everybody for listening. Just the thing about tactics and power, I think that's an important one. Like you've heard probably different political either groups or parties and all of that. I think it's always important to remember tactics are just tactics. We'll go away and use them, but make sure they're effective. Like what's the point in having 40 people stand there and say this now changes the next day? What's the point in having 4,000? What's the point in having a million? And now changes the next day. Like tactics can be assessed on their effectiveness. And then the other thing about power, I think you're 100% right, and to constantly reanalyze what power is, but also who are you giving power to? Who in your actions are you giving power to? By voting in a certain way, or taking part in a certain process, and how much that power are you giving? Are you giving it away today and coming back in 4 years? Or are you giving it away and saying, I'm watching you every day? You know what I mean? So I think we all need to review our tactics, review their effectiveness, and always learn the lessons of who you give your power to and why, and how you take it back.
Thank you. Stafford?
I can't think of short. All I can say is, in line with this conference, this panel today, there is no justice. The system is not about giving justice, it's quite the opposite. There is no justice, there's just us. And we have to decide who just us is, and we have to come together and stand. They're cowards. The people who run this system, they're actually cowards, and if we stand up in front of them, if there's enough of us, they will back down. They have to back down, because power lies with the people. That's how it is.
I'd like to conclude by thanking all the speakers. Personally, I found it really interesting and some incredible work being done and great examples of fighting back, which, you know, there's things today which I'm going to take into my own work. Thank you for staying so long. It's been quite a long discussion. To remind you that the panel discussion this afternoon, there is no British Justice, at 3 o'clock. Is online if people wanted that. And also a reminder, which probably isn't needed, but I'm going to give you it anyway, is that tomorrow is the march and rally. There is no British Justice, the theme for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday this year, and it's assembly at the Creggan Shops from 2:30, and Eamon McCann and Bernadette McAllister are the speakers. Amazing, you know, all them years ago in the back here, you know, just you just can't even begin to say, I can't even begin to say what I think about both of those people, because I just hold them in such high esteem. Also, Kate Nash and another guest speaker, Claire Daly, the MEP for Dublin. So you've got a platform of fiery speakers there. So you know, through the sadness of the commemoration tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to listening to those people. So 2:30, assemble at the Creggan Shops. So see you all tomorrow, and thank you very much for attending.